Before I introduce our guests, just a quick word. The Montana World Affairs Council is a nonpartisan nonprofit, and we're dedicated to engaging Montana's communities and schools in international affairs. And so that means I have one of the coolest jobs in an incredibly cool city and an extraordinary state that puts me doing all of these really great things. I mean, amongst the great things that I'm able to do because of this work is to meet with people like you on issues like this, because I'm a real international affairs wonk, and I love to hear and learn more about what's going on. And then I get to meet people like Dr. Heather Ashby and Ambassador Bob Loftis and directly and get to learn their perspectives on what's going on in the world. And that is really cool. But I want to share with you what is maybe one of the most cool things that I get to do in my work, which is what I did today. Dr. Ashby and I drove up and visited students in St. Ignatius, Charlo, and Polson. So after a long flight out from Washington, D.C., we jumped in the car early this morning and went out to these schools, because that's one part of what we do at the Montana World Affairs Council. I love to engage communities like this, and tomorrow night we're in a similar event in Bozeman, but we also go out to the schools, because I hope I don't have to convince you in saying how critical it is that young people across Montana and across the United States understand three pretty basic things. One, what is going on? What is happening in the world right now? The second thing is, so what? Why does that thing that is happening matter to us? How does it affect us? Why should I care? How does this impact my community? And the third one is, now what? What can we do about this? What can I do about it? What can my community, my political leaders, or others do about this thing? So we spend a lot of time engaging students like we did today in these schools or through our school programs. I wanted you to know that, because a lot of what we do, community members see something like this and they think, well, that's really great, Chris. That's really cool. Thanks a lot for that. But we do so much more, and we do it all around the state. Last year, we had over 10,000 Montana kids participate in different programs that we do. That's a huge number. And it's, again, it's nonpartisan. We're not carrying some agenda into these schools. We're simply bringing the issues that matter to Montana and to Montanans into the classrooms so students can learn more and do more. We hear time and again from teachers across the state how difficult this is for them, given the time restrictions, budget restrictions. And so that's what we do. And we do everything completely free of charge. We don't charge any school anything. We never charge community anything. We don't want any barrier to entry in learning about this stuff. And so that's just a little slice of what we do. Now on to tonight's event. Before I begin, I do want to thank our very generous sponsors at the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Stockman Bank and Allegiance. You know who they are. They're part of our community, part of our state, and they help us bring this and so many more activities to communities and to schools. And again, special thanks to the ma'am and all of the staff here who hosts us and welcomes us, and then Jacqueline Llewellyn and her staff at the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center. We have so much in common. We cover a lot of the same issues, so why not get together on events like this? So many thanks to both of you. Now, if I can find my notes here, I would like to introduce our very special guests. To my immediate left is Dr. Heather Ashby. She's the Senior Program Officer for the Center for Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Dr. Ashby joined USIP after 7 years with the Department of Homeland Security, where she worked at the intersection of Homeland Security and international affairs. She also focused on U.S.-Russia relations. Her research interests include Russia's activities in the global south, particularly in Africa. Dr. Ashby researches and publishes on Russia's involvement in conflict zones and efforts to wield influence in the global south. She also supports USIP's work on Ukraine and strategic competition. Dr. Ashby received her doctorate from the University of Southern California. To her left is Ambassador Robert Loftis. He served in the U.S. State Department and Foreign Service from 1980 to 2012, where he held a wide variety of assignments, including acting coordinator for reconstruction and stabilization, special representative for avian and pandemic influenza, senior advisor for security negotiations and agreements, ambassador to Lesotho, and deputy chief of mission in Mozambique. He was most recently an interagency professional in residence at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Ambassador Loftis served as the deputy commandant and senior advisor for international affairs of the Industrial College of the Armed Forces at the National Defense University, where he also taught strategic leadership. In early 2008, Ambassador Loftis was the lead negotiator for a status of forces agreement with Iraq. He's also the deputy executive director for the implementation planning team for the creation of the Department of Defense's new African Commando, Africa. So could you please join me in welcoming our very distinguished. So you didn't come here to hear me bleed on. So usually the way this works is we ask our guests to provide a few minutes of remarks, 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes or so. And then we're going to go to questions and answers and a discussion with the audience, and I'll be back up here when that takes place. Over to you.
Well, thank you all. Oh, that's powerful. Thank you all for coming. Heather and I talked before for the program, and unlike what Chris just said, where we would talk for 15 or 20 minutes, we're actually going to talk for 2 or 3. The reason for that is that it's much more useful, I think, and much more interesting. We think much more interesting for you is to just sort of lay the groundwork a little bit, make some brief comments, and then kind of open it up to questions and discussion with the audience. I think it'll be a much more interesting and useful thing that way. Dr. Ashby is actually the expert on Russia and Ukraine far more than I am. So since we're starting off with Ukraine, maybe you'd like to make a few opening comments, especially given what's been going on in the last 24 hours.
Yeah.
And then I'll follow up with just a couple of other remarks as well.
Yeah, so I'll just briefly touch on what USIP does and then into Russia and Ukraine, because I'm not sure how familiar people are with USIP. I wasn't before I received the job, to be honest, and I grew up in the DC area. And so the U.S. Institute of Peace was created in the 1980s as part of the broader response to the Cold War. And the intention behind it was to resolve, mitigate, and prevent violent conflict. But over the decades, we have noticed that the nature of conflict has changed. It's not just military to military, but conflict has become more expansive, especially looking at Russia, it's cyber warfare, it's disinformation, other tactics. And so that's part of what my center does at the U.S. Institute of Peace. It looks at where Russia is involved in violent conflict or supported violent conflict, but it also looks at the other tools in their toolbox. Because one of the aspects of Russian strategic thinking is that they don't separate military fighting from other aspects of conflict. You see it all on the spectrum. So it's not something that you start with disinformation, then you elevate it up. They could pull from any of those tools in their box to create disruption and chaos. And so moving on from Russian, mentioning that about their strategic thinking, now we're trying to figure out what they're thinking and anticipating what's going to happen when Putin gives his speech tomorrow. It's interesting that he postponed it from it was supposed to occur today, and now it's occurring tomorrow. And there are rumors that he's going to call for a mass mobilization of Russians, which would involve calling up reservists and added more to the army, which will be challenging considering a lot of the individuals who would train those recruits into the army have died in Ukraine. And so it shows the potential for this war to escalate dangerously, as well as the potential of annexation of the occupied territories in Ukraine. And if that happens, then there's the potential for Russia to say, hey, we did this sham vote that they did in Crimea to say, oh, people want us there. So then when Ukraine tries to take back their legal sovereign territory, it's an attack on Russia, feeding the potential of further escalation. And so that's something that my center, just as I was reading emails today, is tracking and is getting out there to the public to explain what the implications are if this happens. The other aspect of the war that we're paying attention to is not only the US support for it, but what are the further implications of it, not only for Europe, but the broader international system, and to see what this does in terms of if Russia keeps pushing and pushing, how this inflames other conflicts. Something else that's connected to this is looking at Armenia and Azerbaijan's aggression against the Armenians over a dispute of territory that's been going on since the end of the Soviet period. There's also disputes, violent clashes in Central Asia, and these are all zones where Russia in the past has served as mediators, played both sides in these types of conflicts. And so that's something else to watch, is whether there's going to be a domino effect further that stems from Ukraine and where Russia is previously actively involved, or other conflicts in which there is a clear aggressor taking place in different parts of the world. So I'll leave my remarks there on those big issues and turn to the ambassador.
Thanks. You know, when I'm looking at this, one of the things that strikes me is in many ways how there's a wonderful book written in the 1970s called Every War Must End, written by a guy named Freddie Clay. And it starts off with what may be an apocryphal story about a letter between, I think it's the Russian Minister of Defense and the Russian Chief of Staff in 1905, just as the revolution is beginning to get going in Russia. And the comment was, what this country needs is a short, victorious war to stem the tide of revolution. But of course, they launched this short, victorious war against Japan, and the Russian fleet is destroyed, and the Russian army in the east is destroyed, and it actually flames the revolution even more, culminating in the 1917 revolution. And I'm kind of looking at that maybe Vladimir Putin ought to have read that book, because one of the points of it is that countries are really good at starting wars. They're really good at fighting wars, but they're not really good at getting out of situations when the cost becomes too high. And I think that's what the Russians are beginning to find right now. Even with this, I mean, in many ways, if you look at it, this specter of a mobilization is a sign of weakness, that they weren't able to complete this special operation the way they thought they were. Last week, Putin was in Samarkand in Uzbekistan, and you have a rebuke from Prime Minister Modi of India saying that war is, you know, not the thing we do in the modern age, which, you know, is a little rich coming from the Indians fighting the Chinese and the Pakistanis and each other, but still it's a sentiment. And then Putin actually having to almost apologize or explain himself to the Chinese that he hears their concerns. So he's looking at strengthening NATO, strengthening Europe against him, risking bringing up an internal, strengthening internal dissent, particularly if this mobilization takes place, because so far the Russian people have not borne any price for this war, except for sanctions. He's strengthening China. He's strengthening India, both of which have interest in Russia's traditional sphere of influence. And if you look, you know, said 3 years ago, would NATO expand? Would it be as strong as it is today? Would Europe be as united as it is today? The answer is no, and that's what Putin has done. Now, the danger, of course, is that he might feel backed into a corner, so we're never really quite sure what he's going to do next. But it's hard for me to look at this and say that Russia is going to come out stronger than it is right now. And if you look at, and one of the things that their exports, you know, they were great arms export dealers. If I'm buying, first of all, the Russians can't supply themselves. I don't know how they're going to supply anybody else. And the record of their arms is not terribly good right now. So that's another loss to the Russians, and certainly Russian prestige.
All right. Well, thank you very much for those remarks. So this is how it works. This is now over to you for questions, and, you know, a really unparalleled opportunity to learn about this issue from these experts. I would just ask the same three things I always ask in this situation. And one is that your questions are on point. We're talking about Russia and Ukraine right now. That's a big issue, covers a lot of grounds, but that's the issue here tonight. So I would ask you respectfully to put your questions onto that point. The second is, of course, it hardly needs mentioning here in Missoula, but we're looking for constructive and respectful questions, please. And I don't think I need to say anything more than that, but I know I can trust you on that. And the third and final that you all know that I say every time is that a question is an interrogative. It ends with a question mark. It's not a soliloquy or a monologue about things and opinions. And I say that half in jest, but the other half is, of course, your opinion is interesting. You're here. You have an opinion. I'm glad you do. I don't say it because I don't want to hear your opinion, but the reason I say that is we never have enough time to take everybody's questions. There's always people who are like, I just, I'm waving my hand back here and I don't get a chance. And so please, maybe the less of the intro, and if you would kindly go straight to your question, I would be much obliged. So that's it. Those are my three rules always. And so I'm going to go over here, Dave Cates.
Between the battleship and the woman waiting to take a bath, we're kind of got a little moment here. What I'm just curious about is Institute of Peace that you both have an affiliation with. Can you just explain a little bit more about that, like how that influences or who you speak to when you're in that institute? I think you learn things and you tell somebody something.
Yeah, I would say for U.S. Institute of Peace, it also varies by geographic area, depending on the type of conflict. So one important role that the U.S. Institute of Peace serves is to have discussions with both sides in a conflict where we don't want the U.S. government to get out there that they're talking to a particular side of a conflict. So U.S. Institute of Peace has expert mediators, dialogue experts who go into these war-torn situations and try to get both sides at the table to work on negotiations and to do it quietly, where the U.S. government could say, hey, we weren't necessarily a part of that, even though the U.S. Institute of Peace is funded by the federal government, and there's certain things that we get private sector funds for, if it's education or training related, but largely it's to support the U.S. government. The other aspect of the U.S. Institute of Peace is looking at various issues in different parts of the world and talking to people in those regions. It could be research, it could be other type of projects on the ground to help resolve tensions between groups and other issues that emerge in conflict situations or before a conflict escalates. So it looks like it's headed there. We could try to design a project with USAID funded, State Department funded, to help try to prevent that conflict from escalating. And we take that information and we provide recommendations to the U.S. government on courses of action. And this could be to the Department of State, Department of Defense, National Security Council. So those are a few different things that the U.S. Institute of Peace does, and how it tries to support the government, not necessarily fully agreeing with U.S. government policy, but saying, hey, based on our knowledge of what's taking place on the ground, we think this will be a useful course of action for the U.S. government and to help better direct strategic priorities for U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, just from the other perspective, I spent 6 months there as a fellow and kind of working on how to get the State Department and USIP working together a little better. But also in one of my roles as head of the Office of Reconstruction and Stabilization, one of the things that's really helpful when you have an institution like USIP, for example, is you can do what's called track 2 diplomacy, which is where you bring non-governmental people in who may not want to come in and talk to me as a U.S. government official, but they're going to want to talk to the folks at USIP. And then sometimes you can bring people who you would never get in the same room. If the U.S. government tried to do it under our direct auspices, they won't do it. But if they're invited to do it under the auspices of the Institute of Peace, they're usually more willing to do it. It's also, I think it's important to mention that the USIP also has a really good educational outreach program. They do a lot of teaching and training for younger people, sort of age appropriate materials that they have. Also training people on how to be mediators. A lot of it is identifying people within a country who might take on that role, but may not necessarily have the full skill set. So there's a lot of that. I think that one way to think about USIP is it's a think and do tank. That's where I would go from there. It's a great institution, by the way. It's well flies under the radar, but it is one of the. It is. I mean, I was only there for 6 months, but I still think it's a great institution.
And it's so cheap. I would just add that we spend what, $750 billion for DoD, but the U.S. Institute of Peace is funded at $55 million. And so that should let you think about that for a moment, and that we're doing all this work quietly. We can't announce what dialogues are taking place, but they're taking place on this shoestring budget while we are funding this massive war machine that is DoD.
Yeah, Rick Lagat. One thing you both failed to mention about the Institute of Peace is that it's the most beautiful building in Washington, D.C. Whenever we cross that bridge, we live there most of the time. Our granddaughter, when she's with us, says, "I don't know what they do, but I want my first job to be in that." So if I could follow up on that later, that'd be good. I have a two-part true question. First, and I don't know what the rank order of them would be. In Mr. Putin's effort, as I see it, in trying to reset the old Soviet bloc and using Ukraine as a launching point, the question is, can he ever, and therefore what's his own personal risk, can he ever reestablish himself as anything other than a pariah across the world, if you count the nations that may reluctantly, and China is uncertain, to be his ports in the storm? What's left for him other than a coup de grace at some, or coup de grace at some point? So that's question one, but not unrelated is some question one. It's A to B, and that is, can the EU hold? You referred to the united effort of the European Union. A lot of folks, depending on how tough the winter is going to be, are concerned whether or not EU holds. England, or the United Kingdom, has a new far-right leader. We don't know much about where he's going to land. The Italians are playing footsie with an even more extremist right-wing leader, a Putin supporter in her past. Can that hold, and how do they relate to each other?
Well, I mean, I think the short answer on the second part, I'll take the second part, which is I do think they can hold. You know, the Europeans have been actually remarkably resilient. I would not characterize the new Prime Minister of Great Britain as being far right. She's conservative. She's actually in some ways been described as a political chameleon. So I think this is one where public opinion will play a large role. It is going to be a rough winter. I mean, it's going to be a rough winter no matter what, because the one thing that the Russians have is, I mean, you know, one of the main weapons they have is their control of energy prices. And they're clearly using this as a weapon. But one of the things they've done is they've cut off the supply of natural gas to Europe, but they don't have a new customer for it. And it's not like you can build a new pipeline to China tomorrow. So they're actually costing themselves a significant amount of money in the process. And they're also driving the Europeans a lot faster and harder towards alternative sources of energy, which means an even more difficult time for the Russians in the future. You know, a lot of people like to say that freedom isn't free. Well, folks, this is the time to put your money where your mouth is. There are going to be inflationary costs. The governments in Europe are probably going to have to pump out a lot of money in energy subsidies here. If they can do that over the long term, over the medium term, I mean, I think if they can make it through the winter, they're going to have a good shot at this. And you know, they have a clear, everybody's got a clear target at their ire, which is Vladimir Putin. He's the one that started this war. He's the one that's continuing it. He's the one that shut off the energy supplies. And I think there is a concern, particularly among those, the easternmost members of NATO, Poland, Hungary, and others, and any of them that have any size of a Russian population at all, kind of take a look at that and they go, yeah, we can see him gobbling Ukraine and then turning his sights eastward or westward rather. I'll just give one quick anecdote. One of the things I did was I negotiated US military bases in Bulgaria and Romania. And when I showed up, literally the first thing that the Romanians said to me was, "What took you so long? We've been waiting for 50 years for the Americans to get here." I don't think that's changed all that much, and I think it's actually made it even more so for with the invasion and the brutality of the invasion. Every day there's a new revelation, and I think that will help to hold the Europeans together.
Yeah, on the first part, I wouldn't necessarily say that Putin's trying to recreate the Soviet Union because has to deal with his thinking and others in his circle about Ukraine and Slavic people in particular, because there are battles flaring up and established conflicts in Central Asia and the South Caucasus where Russia has been trying to go in with military might and control the dynamics of those conflicts. It's very particular to not being able to say goodbye or let go of Ukraine because of the historical dynamics and the way the Russians have viewed Ukraine. The other aspect is this idea of the Slavic people being a distinct civilization. And so if Ukraine breaks away and gets more into the European sphere, European integration and NATO, that sort of breaks that idea of having Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine united together as a distinct civilization that could counter the West. And so it's all these different aspects of Russian imperial thinking also at play. Russia has trouble thinking of themselves as a nation state if they're not in an empire form. And that's always been a challenge that goes back hundreds of years from the Tsar's period to the Soviet Union, which Russia also dominated that imperial framework. And so it's trying to have that hold on an empire. And the other aspect is people forget the Russian Federation is an empire. It has these states within it that technically have some independence, but really don't, that they're limited in their capacity to shape their own foreign policy, their domestic policy. And so it's that inability to let go of empire. And with Putin, I'm not sure what's going to happen to him because right now, I think he's fighting for his life because you just don't resign when you're president of Russia. Medvedev is something else. You just don't leave. Like, oh, didn't work out. I'm gonna just go to my dacha. They're like it's a coup or someone takes you out. And that's what his options are right now. And he's battling with these ultra nationalists who go farther than him, saying you need to go in and take all of Ukraine and destroy it. To others who are like, no, why did you do this? But we're going to go along with it and feed the propaganda machine. And so that's the dynamics right now shaping up within that inner circle of the Kremlin. And I think everyone's just waiting to see where it falls as things play out.
Thank you. Greg?
Given that Putin clearly was hoping for a short, victorious war, and he's had so many logistical problems and supply problems and manpower problems, is mobilization really a threat? Do they actually have the capability to do something they haven't done already?
I don't think so. And I think part of that is that I don't know if he received accurate information from the people around him, be like, hey, this isn't a good idea. And whether they said that or they're just like, oh, this is a brilliant idea. I don't want to die, so I'm gonna tell them this. And so I don't know if they're planning out like, oh, if you do the mobilization, that could take a seriously long time. You're also have to deal with, like, even though Putin remakes the laws with his cronies of Russia, there's still some aspect of trying to adhere to those laws. Otherwise, you create complete chaos in Russia. It's just a free for all. And so I think the mobilization would take an extended time because you need to train the people. Well, first you need to call them up. And then you're assuming that they're going to show up when they're called up, because there are already situations in which families are hiding young men to avoid this scenario. Then you need to train them. Who's going to train them? And then you need to supply them with arms and equipment. Does that even exist anymore? Because their whole defense industry was this massive patronage network where corruption was high, and so what he's noticing now, what others is like, oh, when we're spending all these millions of dollars, there is a significant cut to oligarch or some other official that is hindering the ability of the forces to operate. So I don't think mobilization will do much to turn the tide of the war.
Thanks. Two-part question, I guess. We talked about Putin's actions maybe strengthening EU. Is there some part of our sanctions that might be strengthening the Russian empire? And number two is, are we or should we be more worried about who might replace him?
Two great questions. Yeah, I'll take the sanctions one if you want. Sanctions are a incredibly blunt and often ineffective tool. I mean, it's like, if we can't think of anything to do, let's throw sanctions, and then kind of hope that they work. Usually what ends up happening with what you try to do in many cases, you try to target the sanctions against like the key oligarchs surrounding Putin. So they can't travel to the United States. They're Western or Western countries. They can't, their assets in the West are frozen, make it much more difficult for them to get it out. And most of these people are pretty smart. They already know where to hide their funds and do other things. But there is at least you do put some pressure on them. What you try to avoid is, at least in the beginning, is not to punish the average person, because that just gives a wonderful propaganda victory to the people, to Putin or whomever. The other thing is you can't really control them in a way. I mean, one of the, we put all these sanctions on Saddam Hussein, for example, and then we had the whole oil for food program where they were, they had controlled sales of their oil, supposed to be able to buy food and medicine. Well, he just didn't buy the medicine. And then he blamed the West for all these deaths of children and others in Iraq. And it was if you're willing to be that brutal, you can do it. And Putin has shown that he's been that brutal. Eventually, you could drive them into becoming more autarkic, more self-sufficient. That was certainly the case in South Africa, for example. So yeah, I mean, sanctions are helpful. They're part of the tool, but I mean, if we were just like right now relying on sanctions and we weren't providing all the arms and intelligence and other support to the Ukrainians, they'd be on the other side of Ukraine right now. Sanctions alone won't do it.
Yeah, and I would add that this is a place in which institutes of peace step in, is to have those quiet discussions with the Ukrainians and Russians and to say, hey, what will it take for this conflict to end? What do the Ukrainians need Russia to do? Would it be going back to the territories that we held before February 24th? Would that help trigger a ceasefire to do broader negotiations? And so there could be a situation in which there are some Europeans who are trying to figure out what is the context for negotiations and how to prepare European partners to help support bringing Russia and Ukraine to the table. In terms of Putin and what may happen, there is the possibility that who ends up in power if Putin falls could be someone a lot worse. You can't tell. For all of our intelligence, it's still pretty difficult to have a good idea of the ins and outs and flows of perspectives within that inner circle within Russia. One expert said that Patrushev, Nikolai Patrushev, the intelligence chief, may end up being the next leader of Russia if Putin falls, and that person is pretty ultra nationalist. And so I don't anticipate that you will see a dramatic change of course, because whoever comes in is going to be tied to the security forces because of their strong grip on the country. But there's also the possibility there could be a dark horse that we don't know about, which has been a trait of Russian history. Is that, oh, yeah, here comes Stalin, not the brightest or the strongest person, but able to manipulate the system and bring various factions together while clamping down on the ones who were the ultimate threat. So that could also be the case. So you could have someone right now trying to negotiate the various factions that Putin helped level out and mobilize in order to take power. And we're not sure. We'll know when we know, unfortunately.
It's Windsong Redtail Hawk is my name. I have a question for both of you, and it's about Vladimir Putin. He's not very popular in Russia, and I lived there as an English teacher for a year. And when I was there, whenever Navalny called a strike, it shut down countless cities across the entire country of Russia, including St. Petersburg, where I lived. And my students were all young professionals in all different walks of life. And all of them, I was not allowed as a resident of Russia to ask anything political, but they all brought up in class and otherwise, they all said they didn't like Putin and they didn't like their government. And they had nothing against Americans, for example, because it was only governments fighting, not people. So, and that was universal, like all hundreds, thousands of people I met. So he doesn't have a lot of support. He's not well liked among the normal people. So you were talking about, Putin tonight or tomorrow, whenever, might now mobilize everybody or try to. And so I'm just wondering, from both of your knowledge, are there any peacekeeping efforts behind the scenes with the real people, in addition to anything that might be going on an NGO level or a governmental level? Because I think there is support for not having the war and not having Putin do a lot of these things. And I still see these people, many of them every day on Facebook and the internet, they find ways around, the firewall, and they are still of the same mind. They haven't changed their minds. So there is a movement. So I'm wondering if you could speak about any peacekeeping efforts relating to that reality behind the scenes.
Could you restate the question? I'm not sure everybody in the back heard.
Is to see whether there are any peacekeeping efforts to engage Russians within the country, especially those who are opposed to Putin. And I would say, generally speaking, it'll be the role of organizations such as the Institute of Peace, and there are examples of like the European Institute of Peace, that in situations you could provide support to civil society, whether in exile, in the case of Russia, in which you had a lot of brain drain of people leaving Russia, independent journalists, other individuals who are spread throughout Europe and the South Caucasus and Turkey. And so in that situation, I would say I've heard of organizations doing that, and governments reaching out to support Russian civil society and trying to find ways of getting information about what's really happening in Ukraine into Russia to break through the propaganda. And so that is actively happening. It's just you won't hear that much about it, because if it is successful, you definitely won't hear about it until afterwards. So there are efforts taking place.
Yeah, I would, I agree. I think one of the things that oftentimes it's really frustrating when you don't see the stuff in the news. The fact of the matter is that if it becomes publicized, people's lives are in danger. They're already in danger just simply by speaking out. Or they're certainly facing long jail time or even conscription, being sent to the front. I mean, there's a lot of penalties, and certainly recently there were these municipal authorities who signed a petition that Putin should resign. It takes a great deal of courage. Certainly anybody who inside Russia who was like overtly identified as getting support would be immediately tagged as an enemy of the state, as a tool of the CIA or a tool of the Europeans. So all of this stuff has to be very, very sub rosa. And if it comes to a point where I think one of the things to think about is that at some point, this war is going to come to an one way or another. And how do you start rebuilding those relationships across Europe? And with the rest of the world for that matter, but particularly within Europe, and that is really going to be a strain. One of the things that the Europeans tried to do, for example, by their dependency on Russian energy supplies, was to bind Russia more closely economically to Europe, in the sense that this would prevent exactly this kind of action. It's kind of, if you kind of take what the French and the Germans did after the Second World War, the very beginnings of the European community, the European Union, was to do exactly that. Well, it hasn't worked in this case. And I think for the Europeans in particular, while they're going to want to reach out to the Russians, they're going to want to try and rebuild these citizen to citizen ties, they're also going to be really leery about making themselves that vulnerable again to Russian energy hostage taking.
We've all seen a lot of, or heard of the disinformation being spread in Russia by Putin, but how have you seen him spreading it outside of Russia? And do you think he anticipated that to be an effort that helped him more as the war was starting?
Yeah, I would say the disinformation has extended beyond Europe and is active in Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia. One researcher found that it was specifically targeted in BRICS countries, so Brazil, India, South Africa in particular, because China, yeah, don't worry about China. They're already amplifying some Russian talking points. And so it wasn't, they weren't only doing it in English or Portuguese in the case of Brazil, they were also drilling down into particular languages in South Africa to target. And this is a technique that they did during the Soviet period, which they were able to learn the different vernaculars within a country in order to enable the effectiveness of their messaging. And so Russia really hasn't lost that capability. And so that's where the disinformation is moving now. It's moving from Europe and Ukraine, where they were testing ground, saw the effectiveness, and down shape shifted to other regions of the world. And I would say for Latin America, what we're looking at is how Russian state TV is still embedded in certain countries as a channel option, like CNN, here's RT and Sputnik. They also have, I think last time I checked, like 6 months ago, because I was looking into it for COVID propaganda for the Sputnik vaccine, is that they had over like 20 million people for their Spanish language programming on across social media channels. And so that's something to also pay attention to. That's not getting a lot of attention because the benefit of targeting Latin America is just how diasporic Latin America is in connections to the United States. So that's also shaping how that disinformation about the Ukraine war is taking shape. And that feeds into some of these votes that come across in the UN, where people won't, for countries won't outwardly say that they're opposed to Russia or they support Russia, but they're abstaining from votes or not voting at all, or showing up to vote. So it's interesting dynamic happening in other parts of the world.
It was here. A lot of questions coming, everybody. Straight to the point on the questions from now on.
You both talked a little bit about efforts at brokering a peace and sort of who might be doing that in Russia and Ukraine, but I wonder if you could sort of fill in or add what you know about what are the forces or the people in Russia, in Ukraine, and then maybe beyond in the EU or Asia or America who are hampering those efforts in negotiating.
I can take a stab at that. Yeah. So one thing we all have to bear in mind is that there are two principal players here, the Russians and the Ukrainians. And right now, I think you'd be hard pressed to get the Ukrainians to say, yeah, we're ready to start talking peace with the Russians. I mean, they've made it, President Zelensky has made it quite clear that their war aim is to get the Russians out of Ukraine. And as long as they're getting the support that they're getting right now, I don't see them relenting on that. And quite frankly, I mean, I would share the concern of a lot of people is that, let's say, for example, a ceasefire in place. All that would do would allow the Russians to rearm and come back. And so it's a hard thing to say, but if you're kind of looking towards the future, one of the things you have to do is make it clear that the Russians are not going to win. And once you get to that point, then you can actually start serious peace negotiations. But I don't think the conditions are right for them right now. Not with the Russians. You know, they've just announced they're going to hold these referenda in some of the territory that they control and some of the territory that they don't actually control. Which suggests that, you know, which more than suggests, says that they're going to lay claim to this territory that Ukraine is not willing to give up. So I think it's probably we can start thinking about the structure, about what we might want to look at. But until the situation's a lot more settled, I don't see that there are going to be real serious peace talks at this point. That the Ukrainians simply aren't going to do it. And I don't think their Western allies should force them to that point.
Yeah, I would say pay attention to Turkey, India, Israel, and China, because those are leaders that Putin listens to, and they are recently escalated to a degree of calling Putin out, or Putin acknowledging openly, like, hey, China, we hear your concerns. And it's like, what were those concerns? And so that would be the framework to help put additional pressure on the Russians to not escalate this war further to the point of doing the mobilization of using harsher and more brutal weapons in the campaign of escalating the brutality against Ukrainians, even though I don't know how can you torture at a higher level based on what they have done to the Ukrainians in different parts of the country. And so I would say, look out for what those leaders are saying about the Ukraine war. And then Turkey was also trying to play a mediator role previously in the negotiations. And that's where the talks were happening at one point, in addition to Minsk. And so I would say that Turkey, it has been pushing for more talks and negotiations, and seeing whether Erdogan or another representative may be flying to Ukraine, say, hey, what do you need in order for to come to the table with the Russians?
But to make it even more complicated, one of the most effective weapons that the Ukrainians have are Turkish drones. You know, so they're trying to play a media role while they're supplying arms to one side. Kind of an interesting dynamic there.
Well, that's the frenemy relationship between Russia and Turkey, is that they're involved in multiple conflicts on opposing ends, but it always stops from being an all-out war between Russia and Ukraine in each context.
The immense damage that has happened in Ukraine. Can Ukraine sue Russia for reconstruction costs, for trauma costs, for all of that has happened to that country? Is the World Court, is there any power that the Ukrainians would have for reconstruction and repair of that country?
The short answer is no.
No.
No, I mean, there are two courts. There's the International Court of Justice, where one state can take another state to court for different kind of damages. The problem with that is that both sides have to agree, one, to go, and two, to be bound by it. And I don't see the Russians being bound by that. And then technically there is the International Criminal Court, which wouldn't handle the kind of economic monetary damages that would go after war crimes. Russia, like the United States, is not a member of the criminal court and doesn't recognize its jurisdiction. So the only way that would happen is if somebody who was a Russian leader happened to find themselves in a country that was a member of the court, they could arrest them and turn them over to the jurisdiction. But again, those people are not likely to be in countries where they could be turned over to the court.
One thing Ukraine is trying to do, where you hear about Ukrainian officials traveling to different countries, and this has been a discussion about the seized assets of oligarchs and the Russian central bank, whether that could be turned over to Ukraine. And so there may be a push by the Ukrainians to encourage European countries and the US to adjust their laws or see what's feasible under existing laws to turn those assets over to Ukraine.
So here, and then I'm gonna work my way back over to the side.
And specifically, my question a little bit based on what was just said, specifically about other countries negotiating roles and what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. I appreciate that you mentioned the role of Russia's invasion in Ukraine and their actions on escalating hostilities in other places of the world. Specifically, I think of Turkey addressing and reclaiming Greek islands and trying to take ownership of Greek islands. And I'm also thinking of the behaviors of China, and they're trying to reclaim Japanese islands. So we're having a conversation with a friend, a person in Japan, a couple of weeks ago, and he said, reflecting on what's happening in Ukraine, I'm very concerned about Japan and Japan's safety, and I hope that if China continues to be aggressive to Japan, the United States will come in and give us weapons that they want. And arms trade is also very interesting when it comes to Turkey addressing Greek islands, because the US is, advocating for Greece, but on the other hand, selling to Turkey arms. So can you describe the role that the arms trade has in creating dynamics?
All right, so, well, that's a multi-part question. So let me start with, actually, the easiest part is that in terms of Japan, the United States has a treaty relationship with Japan that if they are attacked by an outside power, we will defend them. It's not the same as Ukraine, where we don't have that legal obligation. We have a legal obligation to come to Japan's defense. We have major military bases on the main islands in Okinawa. The Japanese, just as an aside, the Japanese spend a considerable amount of money providing for the support of those bases in Japan. We do a lot of training with the Japanese. The Japanese have, because of their constitution, they call it the self-defense forces. It's actually one of the most competent militaries on the planet. And it would give the Chinese pause. You may have also heard President Biden over the last couple of days, I think 5 times in the last several weeks, say that if China attacks Taiwan, the United States will help Taiwan defend itself. Congress just passed a new strengthening the laws committing us to Taiwan's defense, even while we continue our one China policy. Drives the Chinese absolutely nuts when we do that. But I would say, like, for example, the Chinese are looking very closely at what's happening in Ukraine from a variety of levels. One is the ability of what was supposed to be a much undermanned, underpowered military has outperformed what was supposed to be one of the most powerful militaries on the planet. And so you're thinking about, military is always this dynamic between offense and defense, and which is going to have a stronger role. So they're thinking about, yes, it's a very different dynamic. And of course, doing an amphibious invasion is one of the most difficult military feats you can possibly think of. So they're looking at, okay, if we do decide that we are going to take this island back, if the Taiwanese declare independence, which is a red line for China, will they go in, and what is it going to take to do it without completely destroying the island? Because now so much of China's economy does depend on Taiwan. Second part they're going to look at is the willingness of the West, and in this case, the United States in particular, but probably the Japanese. What kind of economic price are we going to be willing to bear to support Taiwan? Are we going to put our money where our mouths are again on this? And if the Europeans break and the United States break when it comes to Ukraine. We just simply get tired of supporting the Ukrainians. That does potentially, I don't want to, I really hate to get into cause and effect on this, because these kind of calculations depend on personalities, on the leadership. They depend on the calculation of national interests. They depend on just kind of, you know, what your thoughts about the overall situation are. But if you're a country that's thinking about making these kind of attacks, then yeah, if you're saying, well, I think I can get by with this one, you can do it. Now, we could still be, you know, all the deterrents that we can possibly think of still may not work. I mean, nothing is ever guaranteed on this. You know, arms sales are really an interesting thing. I mean, a lot of our own defense industry depends on sales of our material abroad. We tend not to sell the top line of what we have. For example, you know, the F-35 only goes to a handful of very close allies. You know, we sell F-15s to practically anybody who wants them, but we degrade their capabilities considerably depending on who we sell it to. And, you know, when we were going up against Iran, you know, Iran for a while had some of the top American equipment out there. Yeah, I'll just say personally, I think we ought to slow it down a lot. I don't like flooding everybody with arms just because it makes it so much easier to shoot everybody. And the other thing you have to think about too is that, you know, the real weapons of mass destruction are not necessarily, you know, the high-end weapons. It's the AK-47s, it's landmines, it's, you know, the small arms that allow people to really go after each other in these intrastate conflicts, which, while we're all concentrating on Ukraine right now and the possibility of, you know, greater war between countries, it's probably worthwhile thinking that most of the wars that are going on in the world right now are happening within countries, and that's not going away.
Yeah, I would add in terms of arms sales is to look at Turkey, because they've been increasing their capacity to have a domestic defense base. And that has started with their drones, and it's been supplying Ukraine with drones, but it was also a factor in turning the tide of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan in addition to using heavy artillery, was using Turkish drones, and that's how they were able to escalate the situation, but also have the upper hand in their conflict with Armenia. And so recently, Azerbaijan did an incursion into Armenia, and drones were part of that conflict. And so I would pay attention to where Turkish drones show up, because I think it's going to be a similar situation in the way that Chinese arms and Russian arms have been supplied to various countries, is that there are no real stipulations tied to it. With the United States, if they're provided arms, you have to agree to certain terms. Russia, they didn't care about any terms. They just wanted to know whether you could pay for the arms. And I'm imagining Turkey will be the same way. They're expanding their relationships, not only established places in the South Caucasus supporting Ukraine and Crimean Tatars, because they have always been outspoken about that and what Russia is doing, but also looking at Africa, where Russia was one of the largest arms dealers to African nations, in particular Egypt and Algeria. And now that Russia may be unable to supply those arms, who are they going to turn to? But it's most likely going to be looking at those Turkish drones and looking at a different way that warfare will take place. It's not just heavy military, it's up in the sky.
Speaking of weapons, I know recently they said that Russia is actually buying back some of the Cold War weaponry that they sold to North Korea. Is this really the level that they are using now? And since they cannot recognize themselves, obviously, as you said, they are probably not selling to others either. Where do they plan to get their weapons?
Iran, that was a conversation that took place, not a conversation, but a meeting between the Russians and the Iranians not
Okay.
too long ago. And there were discussions about using Iranian drones.
Okay,
And can't remember they said where there was other weapon systems as well. But Russia is exploring other options because the other aspect of the sanctions is that Russia was using Western technology to build their weapon systems. And with the sanctions and limitations on exports of that type of technology, it remains to be seen how Russia is even gonna, if the conflict ends tomorrow, Russia's held accountable, whether they will ever get back the capability of building up their military to the level we all thought it was previously, because they would need those Western technology to help in the building of their weapon systems.
well, what about, is it true that they are buying weapons from North Korea?
I haven't looked too much into, I've seen like
Yeah.
article titles about it,
Yeah.
but I haven't looked deeper into it, so I'm unsure, I'm not sure. whether you-
Mostly what, so there's kind of two aspects to it. On the higher tech weapons, that would be like, their own attack drones, surveillance drones. That's the things they're trying to get from Iran.
Okay.
Although the reports that I've seen that the first ones that have shown up have not performed well at all. What they're trying to get primarily from North Korea is just simply, for lack of a better term, dumb munitions, artillery shells, rockets, things that are not precision guided. Because one of the things that one of the Russian military doctrines for decades, for centuries really, has been you just bombard your enemy with artillery. And you just try to flatten them, and then eventually you come in after that. So I think one report I saw, the Russians are firing at least 50,000 artillery shells a day. And they've run out of reserves. And so the North Koreans, North Korea's got one of the world's largest armies, and it follows Soviet Russian doctrine, which is the same thing. I mean, you just bomb everything. Well, there's a couple of big questions. One is how they're going to get all of those supplies there from North Korea, because you have two choices. You can try to go up to that very narrow section of North Korea that borders Russia, try to get it up there and then take it across, or you try to take it across China. And really big question, is whether China would allow that. Because they have been supporting Russia in the sense that they haven't condemned them. They have said that they understand Russia's core interests, which is kind of a vague term. And they've been buying a lot of Russian natural gas and other energy supplies, which has really helped the Russians a lot. What they have not done is really supply the Russians with military equipment, technology, or munitions. It's interesting. I mean, whether that North Korean ammunition would actually even be useful to the Russians. Will it work? I mean, some of it's really old, and it's as much a danger to the people firing it as it is to the people on the receiving end.
And I mean, the reports that I had read said it was basically the Cold War weaponry that they had sold them their old stuff. So,
Well, the North Koreans have manufacturing capabilities of their own.
Let's Chuck and then Elon.
Russia, OPEC, Saudi Arabia, the Saud family, and Prince MBS, I mean, they kind of have a frosty relationship with President Biden. Seem much more comfortable with Putin. How do you predict those relationships will evolve or de-evolve?
Yeah, it's a tough question.
So, it's interesting with, the relationship between the Saudis, for example, and Russia was always a little bit, especially during the Cold War, you have one of the most conservative regimes on the planet, looking at a revolutionary regime. So there wasn't, a lot of love lost between the two of them. They have some commonalities in the sense that, they both all, they all rely on their oil exports or energy exports. But there's always also been a tension about what those price and production levels should be. And so you also have to think of them as being competitors. And so, for example, the Saudis right now, they have, well, it's been going up and down with their production because they always also have to balance off when they're producing and selling oil. If they jack the price too high, that spurs well, for example, domestic production here in the United States, and which they really don't want. They don't want us producing enough oil that really competes with their own sales. At the same time, MBS, he's also, in addition to being a pretty brutal dictator himself, is also trying to modernize the Saudi economy, diversify it out. I have yet to see a regime that's like really repressive, modernized. I don't think he's going to be able to pull that off. So I don't look at them becoming really super close because I think there are enough conflicts between them that are going to prevent that from happening. And quite frankly, the Saudis and some of the others, they recognize that, who's going to buy their products? It's not going to be the Russians. It's going to be the West and others. Actually, it was just before I came, I was looking at The Economist, and Algeria all of a sudden is moving from being a pariah to being a sought after commodity because they are now one of the largest suppliers of gas to Europe. And I think that's actually sort of the side effect for the Saudis is that, going from being he's still a pariah in some ways, but people still court him now. I mean, so there's a lesson there, I guess. It's probably not the most useful one, which is to go ahead and kill your enemies and then wait long enough until people need you, and then you'll come back around.
Yeah, Venezuela. We're like, hey, Venezuela, how are you doing? Let's have some conversations about oil and stuff. But in terms of Russia's relationships with Saudi Arabia, I think I haven't seen too much in terms of government to government engagement. It may be something quieter. Russia's been more active in trying to engage the UAE, which has more ties to the oligarchs. That's the place where they were trying to go to get away from sanctions and to get away from Russia after February 24th. And so I would just add that in terms of looking at the Middle East, is Russia's dynamics is stronger with looking at its partnership with UAE. And the UAE is also has and previously helped Russia evade sanctions.
So Elon, and then this gentleman here in front also.
Last year, European Union imported about 379 billion cubic meters of natural gas. Russia was 159, 160 billion of those. United States and Qatar, 20% maybe. Norway, 15%. Who's going to do this now that they kick the Russians out? That's a big chunk of gas. They're building some terminals in the north side of Germany. One of them can do 4.9 billion cubic meters. That's a long way short of 110 billion cubic meters of gas. It's kind of like what Conrad Breen said, they didn't think it through. Who's going to supply the gas? Or are Europeans just going to start burning wood? Is the IKEA furniture going to go up in flames? Or?
Well, there's a number of things that the Europeans are doing. One is they're increasing their imports from places like Algeria, which is relatively close and easier to do. I know the Germans are actively looking at their nuclear power plants. They had a number of them they were going to decommission. They're bringing those back online. They got coal-fired plants. So all of the climate stuff, quite frankly, right now, at least for this coming winter, is going to go out the window. The French, I think, get about 40, it's either 40 or 60. I'm not quite sure the figure of their electricity from their nuclear power plants. They're kind of the only ones that really haven't started shutting them down. But the upshot is that prices are, I mean, we think at $4 a gallon, we are just suffering of gas prices. I don't know if any of you have ever driven a car across Europe. And I have, and it's $4 a gallon, cheap by European standards. But even that, even what they're, all of the stuff that they're paying, it's just, it is going to be outrageously expensive for them. And there are going to be shortages. They'll be rolling. I don't know if they're going to get to the point where they'll be rolling blackouts, but it's going to be a rough winter for them.
It just seems kind of obvious that Nord Stream 2 was done pretty much the same time the 82nd Cavalry showed up in Warsaw. It sort of looks kind of like they didn't want Nord Stream 2 to start running. And that was 110 cubic meters a year on top of what they were doing. So they would have been like 65% of the goddamn fuel supply of Europe had they started that running. You start thinking, did they do that on purpose?
The United States government, since the time of Ronald Reagan, has tried to convince the Europeans not to build these pipelines, and certainly not to rely on them at the extent that they have. The Europeans always made the argument that butt out, it's our business. But it was also, as I said earlier, the idea was to try and integrate Russia far more closely into the European economy, following the same model that they had used in Western Europe after the Second World War. Obviously, it didn't work. But from what my perspective and looking at what's being said in Europe is that there is a lot of rethinking about that. It is going to be a very, very painful and expensive transition for them. I think they're going to be looking at a lot of different ways to diversify their energy. But it is going to be an extremely painful and expensive transition for them over the next year. And what Putin is counting on is that it will be so expensive that European support for Ukraine will just simply dry up. That it will be too expensive economically for Europe to sustain that. And if Europe doesn't continue with their support, it makes it a lot harder for us to continue our support as well.
And I would add the other country that Europe is getting gas from is Azerbaijan. And with that escalated conflict, they're sort of playing out the same situation over. It's like, are you going to ignore this act of aggression against a neighbor in order to receive gas, in order to avoid gas from Russia, which is engaged in a war of aggression against the neighbor?
I wonder if you could comment on Russia's strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa. How does that factor in? Whether there are objectives there, including the activities, the Wagner Group, the visit of the Foreign Minister Lavrov recently. Curious as to why they're spending time in sub-Saharan Africa and what specifically they hope to gain from it.
Yeah, previously it was arms sales factored into it prominently. The other is to demonstrate to the world, like, hey, I can still receive meetings with governments and we're not isolated. Just look at this example of I've visited these 4 countries in Africa and they welcomed me and I met with senior officials, if not the leader of the country. So that was an aspect of what Russia was trying to do. It was also to prevent more countries from siding with the West and other global South countries against Russia for its war in Ukraine. Another aspect is the mineral resources of a variety of countries in Africa that Russia wants to tap into. And so they're allowing Wagner to operate, but there are also other Russian private military companies that are operating in Africa that don't receive a lot of attention because you don't have an oligarch who's as flashy as Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is funding the Wagner Group and extracting resources from very fragile environments in Africa.
Yeah, the Russians don't really have a lot to offer Africa other than sort of military and security related stuff. I mean, I served in Mozambique right after the Civil War. And, you know, I just kind of following the Wagner Group operating in northern Mozambique with a little bit of kind of awe. I mean, first of all, why the Mozambican government would do it. Well, I understand why they're incompetent. But the Wagner Group, you know, they kind of stand out as a bunch of pale-faced Northern Europeans going into sub-Saharan Africa, and they don't do a very good, they haven't done a very good job at all. Yeah, it's the Russians. I mean, they're if you're not, you know, one of the leaders trying to in some ways suppress your own people or to gain control of resources, there's not a lot of reasons to turn to the Russians. You can turn to the Chinese. You get a lot better return on your investment, although it has its own difficulty, or you turn to the West. But I think it's primarily this political point of saying, yeah, we're still relevant in this part of the world.
We're going to squeeze in one last question. Right over there.
I just wanted to ask a little bit about some of the work that USIP is doing on the ground in Ukraine. Towards the beginning of your remarks, Dr. Ashby, you said that if you sense that if you believe that a tension or a conflict is coming, you're going to see on the ground projects. Well, now that clearly the conflict is here, is it safe for USIP to be on the ground? And if so, what does that look like? I heard you talk about a lot of diplomatic efforts, but are there things engaging directly with civilians impacted, either impacted by food or shelter, or even helping find alternate energy resources to help people there out?
Yeah, and I would say USIP doesn't shy away from conflict environments. We have offices right now in Central African Republic and Libya, which are very high conflict situations. And so we don't move away from it if there is conflict. We don't have an office in Ukraine. What we do is support local Ukrainian organizations, peace building organizations, to see what their needs are. Before the war, it was one purpose, and now after this escalated war, it's another purpose, to see how we could lessen the impact of the war on Ukrainians and the challenges that they are facing. And that's where our dynamic is with supporting Ukrainians. We also helped sponsor a conference this past summer that featured representatives of Ukrainian civil society and providing them refuge to interact with each other, to, I wouldn't say take a break, but just to get away from the war for a week. And that meeting took place in Salzburg, and it was really focused on what are the needs of Ukrainian civil society. And as a result of that conference, there was a statement released, the Salzburg statement. You can find it on USIP's website and Salzburg Global Seminars website, that was written by representatives of Ukrainian civil society to address the needs of Ukrainian civil society. And so that outlines a variety of issues of elevating women's voices around the conflict, as well as within Ukraine, looking at independent media. So those key aspects that will help further Ukraine with building their democracy and European integration.
Ladies and gentlemen, could you please join me in thanking our distinguished guests